let us discuss about how to improve deep neural network. So Keras is a wrapper. Keras has given a wrapper that can work on top of TensorFlow, on the top of Theano. It can work top of CNTK. So whatever module in terms of deep learning software we have installed, Keras will take the back end of it automatically and start working with that particular backend. So when you where that semi machine has got TensorFlow, and when I installed Keras, so when I run the code, it will give me indication that it is running on top of TensorFlow. But suppose you have Theano as well as TensorFlow, then you need to explicitly change which backend you want to run. And when you install, here as it will be saving a JSON file in your C drive or the document folder, and the file you need to go and explicitly mention that if you want to make sure that let's say TensorFlow should be default, so you can just specify in the JSON file. It is editable and not a very complex CR size. If you face any difficulty, just go to the website and they have enough support for all different type of operating systems. So Keras is just a wrapper, and in a similar fashion, we will be discussing a TensorFlow Learn, which is again a wrapper on top of a TensorFlow. So given this understanding, let's get started that we will be discussing a wrapper. So we will be also discussing about the architectures, and we have already discussed a little bit about what is Keras. And Keras is a wrapper on top of either TensorFlow, Theano, or CNTK. And people don't know like CNTK, Microsoft's Deep Learning Architecture, Deep Learning Library, Cognitive Toolkit. And it is also some kind of library cognitive toolkit. And it would be really good deep learning architecture. Uh, and we can also do the implementation using that. And I have multiple times worked on Theano. So in my opinion, TensorFlow is moving ahead of Theano from the point that we find a lot of functional health, like new functions coming up. For example, sequence to sequence, it took me some time to find out solutions in Theano. But TensorFlow, there is a lot of help available. But as far as computational times are concerned, it is fairly similar, not much of a differentiation. So it's very we can easily say that this is really helpful with the TensorFlow. And there are three main reasons. It is actually very easy and prototyping. And how does it do that? It does a lot of things which we need to explicitly specify. In when you write a TensorFlow code, both they are being defaulted, and the lines are very, very simple to understand because they're most of the things have been defaulted, and some of the lines like session you need to start and intents a flow, and you need to initialize the variables which are required from writing your codes intensive flow. You don't have to do these things in Keras because these already things have been specified, and we can start a model. So when we are writing lesser number of codes, and you can know already we have seen that what we are doing in terms of writing sequential models. So it saves a lot of times in terms of checking whether a particular model is gonna work or not. How does it really work in practice? Some of you may be wondering that if I can do everything in Keras and lesser number of codes and cleaner codes and easy to understand, why do I need TensorFlow kind of implementation where I need to spend more time? So one reason is, and how does it really work in practice, is that when somebody comes to you with an idea, and let's say manager comes to you tomorrow and say that, Hey, can you tell me whether we can create a sentiment model or a classification model for the mails we receive every month from our customers in terms of a daily basis? We receive emails, and can we classify those in some way that they can be better distribution of the emails among the agents? Because as of now, what's happening is transfer rate is around 20 percentage, because mail comes to me and the one guy who doesn't understand that has to be done, then he has to consult with a manager, that who is the SME for the problem. So it is some way. So let me say, okay, I think it is possible to one thing, give me some time to 3,000 or 4,000 emails which have some category assigned, whether to make or Windows kind of example I gave. So he will say, okay, I'll give you tomorrow and you get the data. You have just to do that 3,000 or 4,000 emails. And it is a very crude model, and show it to him and say, okay, I think it is possible to get a great accuracy, but we are getting around 60 to 70% accuracy, and which gives me an indication that probably we will be able to do it the way we wanted for the larger data. So it's really good for prototyping, because you can pull through these implementations very, very quickly. Second is that because it is less grammatically intensive in comparison to TensorFlow, people who don't come from programming background can also who don't know C, C++, and the people who know only Python also can use it easily, because the implementation, because of the minimal code, Keras really wins. And there are some of the reasons somebody would like to use Keras, but the limitation is that some platforms uh, like an API, or you want to make an app mobile or app which you need to deploy your model on Android application, then in those cases there may be some difficulty. That model, no, that platform may not be supporting Keras kind of model object. And then it will be a good idea. That's how normally being done, is that once you have showcased that prototype or POC to your business, they say, okay, it makes sense, let's do it on a bigger data. So while that people do is, then they start building same or similar kind of model in TensorFlow. And TensorFlow is acceptable across the different platform, which is very high. So that it works, you create prototype and Keras showcase it quickly. And once your project is sold, you come back to TensorFlow and start deploying the model from scratch. So that is how a typical model deployment work, where Keras and TensorFlow both are involved. It support most of the architectures which we have, which we can discuss about it, and it will be showing it. In fact, there are several use cases. It also support combinations of these two models, and there is even higher type of complexity, though it will not be placed to discuss. But let us try to understand the different type of sequential models. So we can define in Keras, but all the important architectures, they are available, and very neatly and cleanly we can write the codes with a very less number of code, and we can even combine more than one models to make predictions. And the third, the most important thing about Keras is that it can run both on GPU and CPU. So you don't have to do anything really complex to make your Keras models run on any one of the GPU systems. For example, if you have TensorFlow on your GCP or AWS, then you can easily use Keras, and you don't have to require any additional complex requirements to run Keras there. So from the point of view, it is also very, very easy. So given this understanding that how Keras can be helpful, let's try and see what are the different sections. Intensive flow, there are two types of composing models in Keras, and one is called sequential model, and the sequential model is uh, really helpful to compile and for it has many other advantages. And there is another type of functional composition, and we will be discussing it shortly. And it would be helpful because there are some APIs involved in terms of functional compositions, and we can call these APIs from Keras. First, we have to look on the sequential model, and because as I said, the sequential models or that we stack the layers one top of the another. So it is, if you go to the Keras website, it says that sequential models are nothing but linear stack of layers. And what does it really mean is that we take an input layer and you connect it to the hidden layer, and when these weights which are coming from the input to the first hidden layer being calculated, and the node values have been computed after our activation function, this layer becomes input for my next layer. And all we are doing is we are putting next layer on top of the other, and your model is calculated. So these kind of models, and all the three models, I mean, all the models are densely connected, which is MLP, and the convolutional layer, a model, which is again sequential model, and ORAN, and again a sequential model, because that is the directionality in these models, that we start from input and we make some predictions given the supervised learning nature of these models. It is called sequential composition. Functional composition is another type of composition in Keras, and it has been used for making more complex models. And when I say complex, I mean that suppose we need to bring input in between your models. So in that case, you show, like, I have to go to the website and show what it really means, what's really happening here, and that we like to say whatever no whatever number of features that you give once, uh, this composition is the input, right? So which would be passed in the model, and all the predictions will be made through the input features. But imagine some intervention. Let's say here that when you know some features have been learned, and for some reason you want to execute some changes, right? So you have created a model for sentiment analysis, and all the information you are getting to say whether the sentiment is positive or negative. Let's say the sentences people have written, and from those you have created a model. But let's say you want to intervene, or you want to ingest some information about time, that email somewhere later in the stage of the model, then whether it will be possible or not in sequential, yes, it is not possible, because there is a structure we have already said. But functional composition in Keras gave the liberty to data scientists that if you want to create a model in such a way that it calculates some part of it from the input we have given, and later on you want to combine information like what time the email come, or it came from, or which language it was in. And so if you want to bring in those kind of metadata informations, then probably you can use functional APIs. And there is a very great explanation in Keras example. And if you go and look into the Keras documentation, we can get a very clear idea about it, right? So functional composition models are created via the functional API. Functional composition makes it possible to create complex models such as say, cyclic graphs or multi-output models. So hope it is clear about the difference between sequential as well as the functional composition. But most of the times we use the sequential models in Keras. But in case if you want to intervene in the middle, or if you want to make any changes, then definitely you can go for functional composition, right? I hope till this it is very clear to you. Now let us look into the predefined layers in Keras. So what I have written here is actually very less predefined layers, because in this video our aim is to understand about the to improve the performance of the model, or basically what I'm trying to say here is like we are just going to look into the regularization layer. So if you look into the predefined layers in Keras, there are dense layer, recurrent neural network, convolution or pooling layers, regularization layer, pre-processing layer. There are so many, right? So like whenever we write algorithm, we have included this dense layer, right? So it is basically to pass inputs, and the most important function of the dense layer is to find out the dot product. So that's really, dense layer is really an important layer. And the next one is about the recurrent neural network. And the third one is about convolution or pooling layers. And fourth one is about regularization layer, right? So now let us look into the dense layer first. So dense layer is a widely used Keras layer for creating a deeply connected layer in the neural network, where each of the neurons of the dense layer receives input from all neurons of the previous layer. It performs dot product of all the input values along with the weights for obtaining the output. The dense layer's output shape is altered by changing the number of neurons or units specified in the layer. So each and every layer has its own batch size as its first dimension. Now, let us try to understand about the regularization layer, right? So what is meant by regularization? And that we have studied it in machine learning, right? So whenever you do linear regression algorithm, you might have studied about the regularization techniques, not only in linear regression, in all the machine learning algorithms, we try to improve the performance of the model by tweaking the hyperparameters and all, right? So without spending much time into that, we will try to understand about the regularization layer now. So this layer is used to prevent overfitting, right? So regularization layer is used to prevent overfitting, and regularization techniques are added along with the parameters. So the two important techniques what we use is a dropout and batch normalization. So before that, we should try to understand overfitting, right? So let me give you 30 seconds time, just go through these three diagrams. Let us say we have got a logistic model, and what we want is that we have parameters, and so let's say if I have data on two features, let x1 and x2, and these are the training examples I have got for classification or separating these two classes from one another from the process of learning based on these two features. One way is that if I can fit a very simple model, let's say a logistic model, which is a linear classifier, and it sets up a line, something like this, though it is rather a good model. I don't want that good model. For an example, I want to keep a bit bad model. Let's say it fits this line, then you would see that it is a very straight line, and it is giving us some kind of misclassification that that there are some misclassification I can see over here. So I can call this model has high bias problem because the model is not able to classify the classes accurately, and the hypothesis which is being set is fairly basic, and there is a lot of misclassification in the model, and we can see the high bias problem in the first case, let's say training data set and test data set. And we can see in the models, this kind of models typically output something. Say, for example, the training is giving me around 0.67 accuracy, and the testing is giving me around 0.63 accuracy, right? So I'm saying that it is actually even still the testing is worse than the training, right? So there is another type of example, and I'm using another type of hypothesis here, like I'm using a second order polynomial, and I use these parameters. Instead of fitting with a line, I'm trying to fit it with a parabola or a second order polynomial hypothesis, though it is not being 100% correct. Classification like this one is a misclassified. So you can see misclassification over here also. But by and large, it's doing its job, and we call this type of fit just right. Though it's not a great name, but that's how most of the times we call, and it is just right implementation of typically the output would be something like this. There it is, 90 percentage accuracy on the training data. And say, for example, it is giving around 0.89 accuracy on the test data. So when you see this, it is a good indication of a model because it is doing good on training data set as well as on the test data set. And if you get into this kind of situation, probably you have done a great task and your model is really good. So there can be one more way that you include a lot of higher order polynomials, and your model can be something like it has a very good, fit, and you cannot see any misclassification over here. It is a perfectly fit line. And we have used a high order polynomials, which could make this line changing that much. You can see the line, right? So it's giving me 100% accuracy, or maybe very high accuracy most of the time. And say like, okay, so this is giving 100% accuracy, and here it is giving 0.8 something, right? Okay, 0.8 or 0.7, something like that. Now this is the differentiation, and like if you compare all these, it will be helpful so that you can see how the model is good or badly doing. And it is nothing to do with the architecture. It is just from your, in a model deployment perspective, that how do you really understand that where you have reached. And this kind of problem is called as high variance, or it is also called overfitting. And why it is called as overfitting? Because it is performing well with the training data set, but it is not that much good with the testing data set. That is why always we ask the people to make a generalized model, right? Because if you check the first case, it has high bias, and the second case, it is right, and the third case, we can say that it has high variance, right? So what's happening here is, since the data is very less, the model has memorized all the data, memorized all the training data, and so that it is performing well with the training data, right? And the testing data points are something similar. Since it has not memorized that, it is not able to perform that good. That is why the performance has gone down, right? So this is clear, right? So we can, if we want to make our model, not only does a relatively good prediction on training, but also generalized as well as on the test data set, or the real world data set, right? So whatever you want to call, whenever we reach into this particular situation, you realize that we try to increase the number of layers and nodes and making it more complex. But imagine when we made it complex, that it has memorized the training data itself. Then we need to identify some ways that you kind of make it something like this, so that it can do prediction better for training as well as for testing. And these processes which does this task of making the model generalize, there are a few ways of there are few ways to avoid overfitting. So if you look into this, we can see like one point what I have written is about regularization, and second thing is about get more training data. So most of the times we will be into the regularization techniques in machine learning. That is what we have come across before. And we will be trying to fine tune the parameters, I mean hyperparameters, right? So now what is this get more training data? So we should have a deeper understanding on how to avoid overfitting by getting more training data. Clear? So this is what we are going to see. So why I pause it over here, because this is really important to understand, right? So we have to get more training data with the help of data augmentation. So if you look into this image, okay, so sometimes if I ask people, they say that almost same image, and what is the difference across these images, right? All right. So what is this data augmentation? Can you please think about it for a while so that we can proceed with that? Why we are studying about this? See, for example, here we have trained the model only with the help of 1,000 data points. And now I have 1 million or 1 billion data points. Okay, 1 million or 1 billion data points. Since there were 1,000 data points, the model is able to memorize all the 1,000 data points, and so that it is giving a very good accuracy with the training data set. Why it is overfitting? When you bring in more data set, okay, now the way to avoid this overfitting is that when you bring more data set, it will become tired. That is how we can say, like, it cannot memorize all the 1 million data points, and that is really that's really tough for the model to recollect everything. And that is one kind of method to avoid overfitting, because it will not be able to memorize the data set. All of us know that getting a so now we are trying to get a new data, right? So that's what our aim is. So let us understand what is data augmentation now, right? So data augmentation, so here it is a process of generating new data from existing data. So if you see that, you can see some images, cat images, and if I can just take the mirror image, if I say flip it, then I have created a new image. And some of you may argue that it is not a new image, it is almost the same image, but it is actually capturing new features when you do the data augmentation. And it may not give you as much freedom or as much removal of overfitting as a new data set will do, but it adds some value. So you have some overfitting as a new data. So you have some images, you just flip them when you can do it, right? So let's say you have created it upside down, or you can do zoom of some section of the image. Say sometimes you can do zooming. Zooming is a very simple exercise in data augmentation in Keras as well as TensorFlow, that you see that I want to zoom 20% of the images so that your images look different. So data augmentation can be one of the ways of dealing with overfitting. Another way which we have discussed briefly, like So like basically we are trying to increase the number of uh, training data, right? So now we do not want our model to memorize all the points. So like what I'm adding here is about dropout. So let us see what is this dropout. It is actually very interesting point, and most of the time we will be using the dropout layer one way or the other in all the three architectures which we are going to discuss. And let's look at the intuition that how does it really work. If I have four input features and we have four hidden nodes in each one of these three layers, and let's say this is H1, H2, and H3, and how does the dropout work, that it would be saying randomly switch off some of the nodes while training your model. And what does it really mean? That let's say I have created a probability which okay, so it is creating a probability. Okay, so let me see, this is H1, H2, and H3, right? And so here what I'm going to do now, like we have layers like three hidden layers and four inputs, right? So for first two layers, say we have probability of 0.5, and for the third one 0.75. Let's say just it's an example. Okay, so as you know that we run the model for different number of epochs, and we will see how this mm, comes in picture. And let's say I'm running in a model only for box, and this is the model you have set up, and it's going to run for first epoch. Okay, so basically I have taken three epochs over here. So first the POC randomly, let's say you toss a coin, and let's say for this node, and this node it was, see, let me tell this way. See, some modes it's no, it's choosing, and this may be, these two may be open and these have been switched off. And because here the probability what I have given is 0.5, 0.5, and 0.75. Okay, so randomly, see, it is just an example. So some modes are getting switched off them, and like see here this is getting switched off, right? And basically when I switch off means like the output of this particular node has been converted to zero. And now if you see the output from the model, this particular node would be calculated based on these two nodes, and these two nodes, and then the output will be no the output will do some back propagation to learn the weights respectively, and the prediction would be made in the first step of, and once it is updated we do this process then in the second step. And in the second epoch again I check, and this time let's say two nodes get switch off, right? So see, again it is the choice, right? So that can be that could be decided, and then the prediction has been made on the remaining opening ones. And the prediction is made, and the third epoch I do the same random switching of the nodes, and our model would be making predictions in each epoch. So what it is really doing is that forcing your model to not memorize that how much a particular node contribute, and forcing it to make predictions only with the remaining nodes. It works, and the same way we were okay with the L1 and L2 regularization. But dropout really works very well, and it is very easy to implement. And like we can also see like how it works to solve the overfitting problem. The best we will show normalization, and the batch normalization techniques also we will see in shortly. So this you can see, right? Okay, so these two nodes are switched off. Similarly, these two are switched off, and randomly we are switching it off. So you can see over here like X1 and X3, right? And similarly here X2 and X3. And here in the third hidden layer, what is happening? X2 and X4, right? So this is how the dropout works. So this is one of the idea to avoid overfitting. Now the next point is about the batch normalization. How this is no helpful to avoid no to improve the model, and how this process has been done is same in normalization as well as batch normalization. Normalization. So first try and understand how does this normalization help, right? Okay, so here you can see that we used to normalize the data between 0 and 1, or you normalize the data with a 0 mean and 1 standard deviation. And we have studied it in the machine learning for normalization and how it really helps. One thing is that if I intuitively want to see, let's say this is the actual data, which is no, if x1 and x2, if you see here that the scale of both these values are different. Here there is a less change in the value of x2, however there is a huge change in the value of x1, right? So variance in the values of x1, and imagine these would have been on different scale. Let's say this value is 1, 2 and 3, and these values is like 100, 200, right? So and so some bigger values it happens. So if I have this kind of values, but when you remove mean from these values, there will be like origin and in between. And then what you do is you do the normalization by subtracting mean and dividing it by standard deviation, and your data is a kind of randomized, and it would be helping in terms of learning your model. And some of you may ask this question that why it really happens, data is the same, it was just you have done some kind of transformation, how does it really help in terms of model training? So let's have an intuition from a couple of graphs and see that how does it really help in making your model really fast. So if you look at some of these graphs, just look at the equation. First, this equation is this is the equation of cost function, and what I'm saying is 1 by summation of difference. If you take this particular section as your cross entropy, and it is calculating loss, that what is the actual value and what is the predicted probability, and base is that your cost has been computed, and objective or the process of optimization is that you need to find out ways of W and B or more if you have more parameters, then in such a way that this loss has been minimized. If you plot this data on 3 dimensions, let's say we have W, B, and J. And if you want to see that how these values are, so if it is unnormalized data, and if I had W and B and J, it will not be on the same scale, and there may be values which are different. And for understanding, you can also think the same way that you have different scales. Was W2, and this is one is W2, and the another one we can take it as W1, and because both the features on different scales for this, and your cost function would be more of convoluted, and it's like there would be different spaces in different directions. And if I see the contour plots, it will be kind of this elliptical shape. And what will really happen when the training happens, it will be changing a lot of values, and where the scale is high and lesser values in terms of horizontal direction, because we need to change the smaller values because the scales are less. And any model training really happens scales like this and reaches the minimum value when you kind of standardize your features in the model. Your cost function is more or less symmetrical, and it is easier for a model to do the process that you start from anywhere, then you reaches the global minima. So there was an intuition from any intuition has been applied in these nodes, as well as now if I go back and show you, once we have got this understanding that if my features are on the same scale, it is easier for the model to kind of learn and converge better. But if you look at the architecture, um, if you look at the architecture, that what we have seen before, the multi-layer perceptron architecture, that what no really that what really means is that happens in 3 different layers or 4 different layers we have seen, and let's see call them. So what you really do is, if this is W1 and this is W2, say for example, and if this is W3, just for and this is W4, right? So in this case, what will happen is we will be writing Z1 as W1x1 plus W2x2 plus W3x3 plus W4x4. So here we had 4 inputs, and just say I have taken 4 weights also. So I can write the C1 as W1x1 plus W2x2 plus W3x3 plus W4x4. Similarly, I'll be right for several cases, right? So that would be the sum product of your weights and respective inputs. And this value for all the 3 of them would be of, and all the 4 of them, right? So we can write for Z2, Z3, Z4, right? Okay, so Z1, Z2, Z3, Z4, right? And these may not be scaled. And another step, that once you have calculated this step, the score here, you apply an activation function on each node. So let me call it as a 1, right? So it is the output of a particular node. After I have applied an activation function G on right, so I can apply an activation function of G, and G can be anything, either the ReLU or sigmoid or whatever it is. So whatever activation function we apply, if I want to use, but you calculate their score, and then you use the activation function to get the picture out, and these values are like A1, A2, A3, or A1 or A12, A13, anything, like you can represent it in different scale. And now whatever the values are here, now these are inputs to the next layer, and these values may not be of the same nature the way we got our inputs. Clear? And we have seen that what differences it brings to modern optimization when our inputs are normally distributed or normalized. We have seen in the case of logistic regression, where we just have weight multiplied by weights. I mean, where we just had weights, right? And because there are many inputs, and these are not normalized and normally distributed, or not scaled on all 0 or 1. And if I'm not doing the standardization, I would be facing the same problem if my inputs were not in the simpler network. And what I meant is, if you say x1, x2, x3, x4, and if I had a very simple model like a perceptron and making the output, and these were my weights, and you recall this is a logistic model basically, because these nodes have become input, and if these are not normalized and scaled, I'll be facing the same problem in terms of optimization. So batch normalization is the process in which you normalize the values uh, coming out of the node in each one of these layers, so that when you feed the output from these nodes to the next layer, all these values are normalized in a similar way. We used for our input layers, these are the functions really important to understand, right? So now let us try to understand about I wanted to want you to understand it a little more clear. So normalization is a data pre-processing tool which is used to bring the numerical data to a common scale and without distorting its shape. right? So generally when we input the data to a machine or deep learning algorithm, we tend to change the values to be a balanced scale. The reason we normalize is partly to ensure that our model can generalize appropriately, right? So when we talk about batch normalization, it is a process to make neural networks faster and more stable through adding extra layers in a deep neural network. The new layer performs the standardizing and normalizing operations on the input of a layer coming from a previous layer. Hope this is clear to you, right? So a typical neural network is trained using a collected set of input data called a batch. Similarly, the normalizing process in batch normalization takes place in batches and it is not a single input. So if you have this normalized values with some standard deviation, which your model can learn in the process, that was really helpful. And how we can do it actually, we can introduce two more hyperparameters which are trainable, and you say that you normalize value and with mean and one standard deviation, but you can again do again you can do a normalized value improved one, and you can do it with a gamma hyperparameter multiplied by zero. So ultimately what we are trying to do over here, so that is a part you should really understand. Okay, so and also one thing about the weight, right? So we have seen that, right, how it is starting with some random value, but in the process it will learn the same way as it learned for all the other things like w and b, or w1 and w2 and on. So this function remains same, and through the chain rule it will be learning, but actually we don't have to remember this. And I don't want to get into the application, how does it run. End of the day, all we have to do is like we should understand the applications in TensorFlow and Keras, because we have to just understand, because the TensorFlow and Keras has taken the process. So the normalized values in your nodes are basically not with a zero mean and a word with a standard deviation, they are normalized, and so that the mean and standard deviation value would be identified through the learning process the same way your model learns W's and B's, right? So this is what we have to understand over here. So hope this part is clear to you. Like in this video, just we had a discussion about improving uh, the performance of our model, right? So we have discussed about the regularization and how we can get rid of this overfitting, and we have also seen the important idea of batch normalization about right. So hope this is clear to you. Thank you.